All right, welcome. So here we are. We've reached the final and I think truly brilliant capstone of Capital Volume 1. After we trace that huge historical arc, the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation in the chapters we just covered, Marx now puts his whole theory to the test. He uses the colonies as a kind of real-world laboratory, an environment where all that historical fog that hangs over Europe just lifts. And here, stripped air, we get to see the deepest secret of capital, what it really is, and what it absolutely needs to exist. Let's dive in. So let's start with a really foundational question, one that gets right to the heart of this. If you, say as an entrepreneur, gather all the right ingredients, you've got the money, the best tools, and you even have people willing to work, have you actually created capitalism? Well, the classical political economists of Marx's time, they would have said, absolutely yes. They saw these things not as specific to a certain time in history, but as just natural, timeless components of production, good for any time, any place. But here's the twist. When this exact experiment was tried out in the colonies, the whole system just failed to start. You had capitalists arriving with their cash, their machines, their workforce all lined up, only to find out that the entire operation was completely paralyzed. And this was a huge puzzle for the top economists of the day. What on earth was the missing piece?
Okay, so this is where the theorist Edward Gibbon Wakefield comes in, a figure Marx really focuses on. He figured out what the problem was, and his insight, right here in this quote, is just devastatingly simple. Think about it. When land is everywhere and it costs next to nothing, why would anybody choose to sell their labor to a capitalist? You could just go and become an independent producer yourself. And the key phrase here is combined labor. See, capitalism doesn't just need labor. It needs large-scale, coordinated social labor, all working under one boss. And in the colonies, that was impossible to get because nobody was forced to do it.
This slide really just lays out the core contradiction perfectly. On the one hand, you've got the mother country, England. Over centuries, all these historical processes, enclosing common lands, clearing estates, they had forcibly created a very specific social setup. Land was in the hands of a few, which created this huge, propertyless class of people who had no choice but to sell their ability to work just to survive. And then on the other hand, you have the colonies, where these essential social conditions were completely, totally absent. To really bring this problem to life, Marx grabs this wonderful, almost comical story from Wakefield's own writings. It's the tale of a certain Mr. Peel, who, let's just say, learned this lesson about the true nature of capital the hard way. Okay, so picture this. This Mr. Peel travels all the way from England to the Swan River in Australia, and he brings with him a fortune, 50,000 pounds worth of supplies, tools, machinery, and, this is the crucial part, 3,000 people from the working class. He has all the things, but the moment they arrive, his workers take one look at all that wide-open land, and they just leave. They desert him to become independent farmers. All his wealth, his potential capital, is just left to rot on the beach, because the social relationship needed to make it work is missing. He's left, as Wakefield puts it, without a single person to even fetch him a glass of water. The whole fiasco with Mr. Peel really forces us to ask the essential question. He had the physical things, right? The money, the tools, but he did not have capital. So why not? Because the things themselves aren't capital. What was that critical missing ingredient that stopped his wealth from actually functioning as capital? This is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. To solve this colonial problem, Wakefield created a plan he called systematic colonization. But in doing so, Marx argues, Wakefield wasn't just cooking up a theory for the colonies, he was accidentally making a deeply revealing confession about the true nature of capitalism back home in Europe. And here is Wakefield's solution. It's really a masterclass in social engineering. The key point here is that this is not a market solution. No, this required the state to step in and artificially create the conditions that had taken centuries to develop in England. By slapping an artificially high price on land, the state could block workers' access to it. This would then force them into the wage labor market for a long time. In short, the state had to deliberately and systematically manufacture a working class. And in this plan for the colonies, Marx finds the diagnosis for the mother country. Wakefield's scheme was really just a condensed, transparent, state-run reenactment of the exact same historical process that created the English working class in the first place, a process that Marx, of course, calls primitive accumulation. And this slide defines that exact process we've been talking about, the whole subject of Part 8 of Capital. The starting point for capitalism is not, as the economists' little fairy tales would have you believe, a story about some thrifty entrepreneurs saving up their money. No. The real starting point is this historical, often brutal, process of expropriation, of fencing off common lands, clearing estates, and violently separating the majority of people from any way of providing for themselves. The colonial experiment, then, is so absolutely vital because it just rips away the ideological mask. In Europe, this violent history of expropriation was buried in the past, explained away as some sort of natural, peaceful evolution. But in the colonies, where these conditions had to be built from the ground up, the process was naked, it was deliberate, and it was completely undeniable. And this brings us to the grand finale of the entire volume, the secret that the colonial experiment finally reveals. Capital is not a thing. Mr. Peel's money and machines were just inert objects. Capital is a specific social relation. It's a relationship built on the fundamental separation between two classes, a class that owns things and a class that owns nothing. A class that, having been kicked off the land, is free in that famous double sense, free to sell their labor to whoever they want, but also tragically free of any other way to survive. And so, Marx wraps up his masterpiece not with a prophecy, but with a historical proof. The story of the colonies proves that the basic conditions for capitalism aren't timeless laws of nature. They were produced by force, and they are actively maintained today by a whole web of social and legal structures. Which leaves us with a final, lingering question. If the free market needed this much artificial engineering just to get started, how natural are the power dynamics we see within it today?